Hello and welcome to Social Studies 3201, Unit 4, Population Issues. In this unit, we'll look at four main topics. The first one, 10.1, will be about explaining the relationship between population carrying capacity, science, and technology. Um, Developments that humans have made in the past and continue to make today have had and continue to have impacts on population. So we'll look at some of the major stages in history that have contributed to that. In 10.2, we'll look at how populations change. We'll look at some theories of population change. In particular, we will look at demographic transition. In 10.3, we will analyze challenges and possible responses associated with high population growth rates. So some countries, their populations continue to grow at a fairly high rate. They will no doubt experience some problems because of that. And we will get into what some of those problems are and attempts made globally to address those problems. And in 10.4, we'll analyze challenges and possible responses associated with low population growth rates. So the opposite scenario is 10.3. So first in 10.1, population and technology, the first thing we'll take a look at is this idea of a feedback loop. So we see over here in the visual. A population growth feedback loop is basically a system where the outputs at any one point in the system feedback into that system and make positive effects better or amplify them, and make negative effects worse and amplify those. So, for example, you could have a positive population feedback loop. Okay, so let's say we start with the work output point over here. Work output can lead to access to many resources. Think about a high level of productivity when it comes to food production, or maybe a higher level of healthcare, either through technology or manpower available to provide those services to people. Things like this can improve quality of life for people. As a result, you might have a greater life expectancy. So, with better nutrition and better health care, people might start to live longer. And that will contribute to population growth. So, as people remain in the population because they live to be older, you will have, at the same time, other people being born or added to the population, which will help it increase. And that will, in the end, result in a greater work output because you've now got more people able to contribute to the system. On the other side of it, you can have a negative population feedback loop. Okay, so it's the same example, but a different scenario. A lower work output can lead to less food and poorer health services. Okay, maybe there's a reduction in the amount of employment or available workers and so on that have a negative effect on work output. Thus, these situations can result in a reducing of life expectancy. Therefore, people do not live as long. And your population may decline because of that. And as a result, in the future, you'll have even less work output. Okay. So feedback loops they apply to many different phenomena or events or situations. But in this case, we're looking at how they can influence populations specifically. And these are just a couple of examples that we've looked at here today. So keep this in the back of your mind as we go forward in the unit and look at different issues that can arise related to population. So here we have an activity, 10.1, World Population Trends. You can take some time to pause the video and take a look at that activity, complete it. And when you do so, there are really a couple of main things this activity wants you to deal with, and that would be trends that exist in world population over time. So the first trend, uh, you'll note if you look at the visual over here with the graph, you'll see there's almost an S-shaped line graph. So this represents population over time. We have population in billions on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have time in years. This particular graph starts with the year 1650. And so one trend that we note from what has occurred is that there was a population explosion that began in the last half of the 1600s and went right into the end of the last millennium, in particular up to 1980, thereabouts. And in particular, with that, we note that between 1960 and 1999, the Earth's population doubled from 3 to 6 billion people. Okay. So we get a point where we sort of max out population growth. This roundabout here. Okay. And so as you can see down in 1650, population was rather low, and it had stayed like that for many thousands of years. But some things started to change. We'll look at some of those as we go through this section, which led to population increasing dramatically, and that's the population explosion we talk about here. So generally speaking, we want to look at what are some factors that can contribute to population increase. So we're not looking at a specific situation, we're looking at generally here. So a few that we can look at might be an increase in food supply. Okay, if there's more food available, then that can support a larger population without a significant risk of starvation. Better healthcare, as we already mentioned, can increase life expectancy, keep people alive longer, therefore ensuring that a population remains higher than it would be otherwise. Better healthcare can also contribute to a lower infant mortality rate or number of children who die at a young age. So we'll look at that as we go through this unit as well. More demand for workers may affect population. Either the government may encourage a higher birth rate or number of babies being born for the purposes of filling labor shortages, or migration might be an option to bring in workers from other countries in order to fill those gaps. Less contraception or less contraception available, so lack of birth control, would obviously be a factor that would increase the number of births and therefore your population. And finally, large families. Traditionally, and in the past, it was more common to have larger families, maybe 5, 6, 7, sometimes 8 children, even more in a family. In large part, that was necessary to maintain the family and to produce enough food and do the work necessary in society to meet people's needs. So that would encourage a larger population. So you look at some of the challenges of population increase. What kind of problems could we have? Overcrowding in cities, right? Cities are fairly densely populated anyway. And so an increase in your population would mean that there's more people in a smaller area. So overcrowding can be an issue which could lead to, for example, sanitation issues, being able to clear waste out of the city and to ensure a clean water supply and those types of things. Eventual trouble providing enough food. So down the road, if your population increases too high, maybe your country has gotten to the point where the productivity for food production has reached its highest point. And therefore, any additional people added to the population may have put extra strain on the food supply. Overuse of resources. With more people, we need more things, material goods, raw materials from the earth. So there's certainly an environmental impact there. Could result in things like deforestation, pollution, and so on. Finally, increased spending on children and seniors. If you have a large population of young people, school is an important consideration there, and school costs money. So that's a concern. And also, if you have more seniors, they're the group in society that would likely have a higher level of health concerns. So the healthcare system might feel additional strain. So those are some of the possible causes and challenges of this first trend that we see, which is the population explosion that has occurred within roughly the last 400 years. The second trend is much more recent. The world's growth rate has declined since 1980. Okay, so what we note here is that in 1980, the growth rate was 2.31% in 1980. Okay, and that reduced to 1.25 in 2007. So that's a considerable decrease, and it's the largest decline in population growth that the Earth has experienced throughout all of human history. Okay, so something started to change in the 1900s that contributed to this. And we'll get into that as we go through this unit. So your population growth rate, this number up here that I referred to, is the rate at which a country's population is changing and is often shown as a percentage. A high rate is anything over 2%. Okay, and anything below 1 would be considered a very low growth rate. Okay. So possible causes and challenges of a decline in population growth. It's important to mention here, by the way, as well, that a decline in population growth rate does not mean your population itself is decreasing. What it means is that how quickly the population is increasing is actually slowing down. That's the key point here. So causes of population decrease, it's any number of things that could fit in here. Decrease in food supply. Maybe not everyone can get access to their basic needs for nutrition, resulting in starvation. An increase in disease. Highly infectious disease can take its toll on a population. In the past, smallpox was a very well-known example of that. So, of course, that would decrease the population. Less demand for workers, so maybe fewer births are contributed to fill labor gaps or labor shortages, and maybe migration is lower as a result. Access to contraception, right? So maybe having more birth control available now means that fewer children will be born. And the trend towards smaller families. This is something we'll pick up on as we go through the unit. But you may have noticed maybe amongst your own family or other families of people you know, today it's less likely in our part of the world to have a large family. It's more common maybe for two parents to have 3, 2, even one child, sometimes no children at all. And that's quite a contrast from in the past, where, as we said before, it was common to have 5, 6, 7, 8 children per family. So challenges that can come from population decrease. Abandoned cities. or parts of cities and so on. Maybe, there had been so much infrastructure and services built up over time as population increased that now, if your population is decreasing for whatever reason, some of those buildings, some of those services are no longer needed. And therefore, you get people moving out of some regions and into others to get the services that they do need. That's a possibility as well. Decrease in tax base, right? So governments are able to do what they do in large part because of tax money that they take in to provide for services, whether it's repairing or fixing roads, water supplies, or so on, healthcare services, any of those sorts of things. If there's fewer people in the population, then chances are the tax base has declined, the number of people that you get taxes from in terms of the government. So with a decline in that, there's less money available for governments to spend on the things that people need, which creates a whole other area of challenges that we'll look at later. The cost of providing services to smaller areas becomes a significant problem. And this can be seen in some parts of our own province where resettlement might be on the table for some communities. If you have a small number of people living in a more or less remote area, and the government has to provide equal services for those people as they might to other people in the province, that's going to cost a considerable amount of money to make sure those services are available, whether it's, as we said before, medical services, clean water and sanitation services, or transportation services in terms of ferries and so on, if the community happens to be on an island. And finally, attracting workers for new developments. Right? So if the population has declined and there are still needs that the population has, for example, maybe there does need to be a new hospital built to service the population in a given area. If the population is declining, chances are services, whether it's retail stores or whatever it might be, in that area over time may shut down or close, meaning that there's less services available there for people. And therefore, if the place that is constructing, in this example, a new hospital, they might have issues attracting workers, whether it's people to build the hospital or after the fact, people to work there, especially if the local population doesn't have those workers available. Okay, so these are some possible causes and challenges of this second trend in the world's population growth rate, this decline since 1980. So here we have a world map which shows population growth rates in different areas. Okay, and we have it's color coded here. As we can see, the darkest colors have the highest growth rates, and the lighter the color gets in terms of green here, the lower the growth rate is. And there's actually some places experiencing a population decline. Okay, so the question over on the side here: which parts of the world have highest and lowest population growth rates today? We're talking generally. We don't have to look necessarily at countries. Regions might be fine. If we look at high growth rates of over 3% annually, we'll see that this area here, right, countries in Africa, Middle East, perhaps, some areas here in Southeast Asia, and even in parts of South America here, experience fairly high population growth rates. Okay. These may be classified as LEDCs, or less economically developed countries. And if we look at a contrast to that, we can see that North America okay, generally has a population growth rate of less than 2. Okay, so probably anywhere between these two colors here. Okay, um, Europe also significantly low population growth overall. In China, right, in Japan. So these countries would mostly match up with, and Australia down here, by the way. Uh, these countries would mostly match up with MEDCs, more economically developed. So, as a general trend, we can say that MEDCs tend to have lowest population growth rates globally, and LADCs tend to have the highest. Okay, so this is going to bring up a couple of questions like why, um, and what are issues related to that, or is there anything being done today to change that scenario, and so on. So we will look at this as we continue through this unit. So let's bring it back to population and technology. Okay, how can available technology be linked to population size? Right. So what is it about technologies, new ways of doing things um, that can make population either increase or decrease? So this brings up an important concept, one of carrying capacity. Okay, so the carrying capacity is the number of people that can be sustained by the Earth's resources. Okay, the number of people basically that the Earth can support. Okay, um, so if we think of it that way, new technology and scientific advancement can make us more efficient at using resources, therefore supporting larger populations. Okay, so maybe um, we're more efficient at growing food, right? We have the same amount of farmland, but maybe we have new technologies, uh, new types of fertilizer, harvesting technologies, and so on that can allow us to produce food faster for a larger population. Okay, same amount of land area is available, but there's new technologies, scientific advancements that we have that allow us to have a larger population, and therefore the carrying capacity of the Earth is higher in that example. The other way to look at it here, we got the Earth's resources are finite or they're limited, and if we overuse them and they run out, we won't be able to support larger populations. Okay, so there's a tension here, and certainly a concern about sustainability, right? Can we overuse the resources on the planet? Is there a limit to the numbers or types of new technologies and advancements that we can make? Is there an ultimate limit, for example, to the amount of food we can produce on this planet? So these are concerns related to carrying capacity, but you'll note that they're linked directly to technology, things that humans have developed in order to satisfy our needs at a greater or easier degree. So, what we'll notice uh, in the history of, well, in human history, um, we get different periods that represent major changes in the influence of technology on population. Okay, there's actually 4 of these that we'll look at. The first one, if we go way back to the Paleolithic era, um, back before civilization, um, when people hunted and gathered, um, what we'll note is that carrying capacity of the planet was fairly low. Okay, so if we sort of place us in time here, it's anywhere 10,000 years ago or further back. Okay, um, so humans in these societies moved from place to place collecting food and hunting animals. Right, collecting is a key word here. Right, they're not producing anything yet; they're just gathering what's already there. Stone or lithic tools were effective. and allowed groups to hunt animals and to gather and collect berries and fruits and other things like that. But there was a limit to the amount uh, of food that could be obtained. Okay, um, food supply was unreliable, preventing steady population growth. Okay, so a big concern here might be hunting of animals. Right, many animals are migratory, and some human groups followed migratory animals from one place to another in order to hunt them as a food source. Um, so the population of the herds of animals might affect uh, the amount of food humans have available to them. In that case, things like climate, the amount of rainfall, temperatures, if there's droughts, and so on. Those things could have a big impact on animal populations and human populations as well. So, more or less, we're saying that humans were at the mercy of the environment, more or less. Okay. Um, so, with all those things taken together, carrying capacity, we would say, was fairly low, especially with the example of migratory animals and humans following those groups. You might say that large areas of land were required to support relatively small populations. Many of these groups may have had 20, 50, 70 people, which is a very small population compared to groups we have today. Um, and a very large area would be required to support them based on wherever herds of animals were traveling. So that was stage one. Okay, remember stage one, low level of uh, carrying capacity for the earth. Stage two, we're going to get into the Neolithic era and the agricultural revolution, perhaps the single most uh, important advancement or change in human lifestyle ever in history. This is when farming first developed. Okay, so rather than following herds of animals and collecting berries, fruits, and other plants to meet their needs, people started to farm, which uh, is key because they went from finding food to producing food. And once you start producing, you become more able to control the amount of food, in this case, that you have available to you. So you gain some level of mastery over nature. Okay, so control over the environment might be one way you can refer to it. Okay, so now what this means is that the better humans get at farming through maybe they develop better technologies, um, tools, and so on to help them farm or use more land for farming, they can actually control more or less the amount of food that they grow. Uh, and one thing that we note happens anywhere between, let's say, 8 and 10,000 years ago, we start to see that human communities start to create surpluses of food. So they're able to meet their own immediate needs through farming, but they're able to farm and actually grow more than what they need. And that extra is the surplus. Okay. More available food from each square kilometer of land meant an increase in Earth's carrying capacity overall. Okay, so no longer do you have a small population that has to follow herds of animals over large areas to meet their basic needs. People can more or less settle in one smaller area and actually produce more food than what they would have been able to do otherwise. Okay, so here we got a map that illustrates some of the early um, food production. And you can see some of the various crops that were grown in different areas. So we're in the Fertile Crescent over here. We can see you get barley, dates, figs, flax, fruits, wheat, olives, that kind of thing. Um, But you get, a range of crops depending on where you are. So in Central America, beans, squash, maize, tomatoes um, are being grown. Sweet potatoes in South America, um, coffee down here um, in Eastern Africa there. Uh, and so, anyway, these are examples of crops that are being grown um, all over the world, or at least within this relatively low latitude area. Okay, spanning from here in the southern hemisphere, part way up the northern hemisphere here. Um, so what we note is that in low latitude regions, um, in particular, climatically, those places are going to be warmer. They're closer to the equator. People began to farm and produce their own food at around the same time in history. So we'll say anywhere around about 10,000 years ago. Okay. Um, the crops they grew depended on the climate and the local environment. Okay. And that's just reasonable. That makes sense. Okay. Because you will have geographic differences from one part of the world to another. But the point is that people, perhaps due to climatic changes, a warming of global temperatures overall at the end of the last ice age, people in multiple places started to learn how to farm and make that discovery within about the span of a couple of thousand years. Significant changes come from agriculture. Um, it's one of the reasons we have civilization at all, or some type of complex society. Okay, so for the first time in history, food surpluses meant that people can focus on more than just survival. Um, in a hunter-gatherer scenario back in stage one, um, pretty much everyone in the population, in the community, had to provide for the basic needs of the community. So by and large, um, most adult males would hunt. Most females might be related to collecting berries, gathering plants and fruits and that kind of thing, producing clothing or whatever it might be. But more or less, everyone did the same type of work and were focused on survival. Um, Population would grow and life would become more diverse after the development of agriculture, right? And it's all because of that food surplus we mentioned here, right? If you have more food than you need, then maybe you don't need so many people producing food. Maybe you can have fewer farmers. Maybe some people who would otherwise farm could now work in something else. And that's where job specialization comes in. We actually get jobs developing. Some people remain farmers. You get others who make pots and baskets to contain food and other materials. You get some people who become religious leaders. Some people focus on the military, soldiers, professional soldiers, that kind of thing. Merchants, traders, storekeepers. And we get governments that begin to organize things. Population is starting to grow now because you have more food, right? So instead of 20 to maybe 50 or 70 people in a community, you could have a larger town or city that could have 1,000 people, could have 10,000 people, 50,000 people, depending on where you are and at what time. Okay. So your more reliable food supply has these main benefits: less fear of starvation, improved health overall, longer life expectancy. And these things here contribute to the population increase we were talking about. You get beginnings of towns and cities. You get some centers that develop more than others, perhaps due to location. Maybe they have certain advantages in terms of resources or whatever it might be, or linkages in terms of rivers, transportation, or so on. Trade develops between cities, which will dramatically increase the amount and types of goods that people can have access to. And we also get the beginning of writing, which is key because it involves record keeping. And record keeping, besides the benefit of recording actual histories of what happens at different points in the past, um, people can become more accurate in recording trade transactions or the amount of food produced in a year, um, or tax collection or whatever it might be. So that allows for people to become more efficient and make better use of the resources they have. If you think back to what we mentioned with carrying capacity, that's actually going to help increase the carrying capacity even more because you're making better use of the land and the earth and its resources to meet your needs. So overall, these changes lead to a growing complexity in society, and that's what we mean when we talk about civilization. Okay, so civilization develops around about 5,000 years ago. Um, at that point, you more or less have all of these different elements working together. Okay, stage three, we fast forward a bit um, through the ancient era and through the medieval era until we get to the modern era. Uh, and with stage three, we're looking at the Industrial Revolution in particular, starting round about the mid 1700s. Okay, so in this visual we have on the side, you can see we have horses, and we have a man here, and he's standing on some type of machine that the horses are pulling through a field. And this is actually a type of harvester that allows people to harvest food faster. So what we end up with is the introduction of complex machinery. So the Industrial Revolution was a process by which production of food and goods shifted from simple hand tools to more complex machinery. So for most of human history, most work was done by hand and done by manpower, okay, with the use of tools. It's not until the Industrial Revolution that advanced machinery, which can do um, a lot more work, perhaps faster, um, started to develop. And this is going to improve productivity in a wide range of areas in society. So this improved upon previous sources of energy for production, right? Muscle power of people and animals was used in the past. Um, and eventually you would see coal being used, and we get steam engines and that kind of thing. Um, we would also have oil discovered and developed in the 1800s, which would be used for or production and transportation as well. In farming, you get tractors and machines replacing farm help or people working on farms. Okay, leading to increased urbanization. So if people are losing their jobs on farms in the country because new technology is replacing them and making them redundant, more or less, those people are going to start moving wherever new work is. And cities, urban areas, happen to be where machinery was used uh, in the development of factories. Okay, and that's the work. Factory work is what these people sought. And so you get much larger populations in uh, city areas. So it's the start of actually when we get a shift from people mostly living in rural areas to mostly living in urban areas. Another massive change for human society. Industrial Revolution greatly increased carrying capacity of the land and resulted in the greatest population increase in human history. So this matches up roughly with, um, if you think back to the world population map or a graph that we looked at earlier, where there was a spike in population, that first trend. In large part, it's because of new technologies developed during the Industrial Revolution that helped increase carrying capacity. New technology allowed people to plant and harvest food faster, right? So the seed drill allowed for consistent and faster planting of seeds. Combine harvesters allowed for much faster and effective harvesting of food. Steam engines increase speed at which coal could be mined. So coal as an energy source now could be gathered faster, which could be used for other technologies. So this resulted in more powerful energy sources for transportation of goods and of people, and the production of goods. We mentioned those factories before. Okay, factories are buildings where mechanized production occurs. Um, so they would be able to produce goods of almost any imaginable type at a faster rate to meet the needs of a growing population. Um, Factories would start in the area of textiles and clothing, but would branch out to include almost anything that you can imagine. And of course, they still exist today, and they produce many of the goods that we make use of. The fourth and final stage here that we'll look at is much more recent. It's the Green Revolution or genetic modification. We're looking at the mid to late 1900s for this. And this is related to some new technologies around how food is grown. Okay. The Green Revolution is characterized by increasing food production, in particular through chemical fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides to deal with insects that would destroy and damage crops, improve machinery and techniques, and a development of new high yield or larger crops. Okay, so it's advancements in a number of different areas that occurred in a fairly short period of time. And the thing about the Green Revolution is that it affected a number of places in the world because, for example, Mexico and India, both of those countries started to make use of some of these developments, specifically from the Green Revolution, to help increase their food production in order to feed their populations. And therefore, that would globally have an increase on carrying capacity. Also, genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, foods that have had DNA from other organisms sliced or genetically engineered into their genetic structure, right? So we either get new types of food being produced, or food that might be larger, it might taste better, it might be resistant to disease or damage from insects and so on, which means that you would have more food at the end of the day, whether it survives longer, lasts longer, shelf life, or whatever the case might be. And again, that means at the end of the day, more food for a greater number of people, and therefore an increase in carrying capacity. So these four stages showed a massive change in technologies on our part as humans, but at each stage, we would see a dramatic shift in population. There'd be increases along the way, with, again, the largest single increase being through the industrial period in the 17 and 1800s. Okay, so at this point, we'll pause at the end of outcome 10.1. There's an activity, population change and technology, which looks at some of these concepts that I've gone over with you, and we'll give you a chance to explore those in a bit more detail.